Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of the Afghanistan podcast. Joining us today, we have Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa is a British journalist, photographer, and activist, and currently based in the Middle East, a region she has lots of experience of, which is why I'm hugely looking forward to this conversation. Vanessa, thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me on.
Cool. Vanessa, would you mind, before we get started, could you take a brief moment to just give a description of your background, maybe where you were brought up, how did you get into journalism, and how did you get into Middle Eastern journalism?
Oof. I kind of got involved in the Middle East through my father initially, who was one of the foremost Arabists of his time, and who was ambassador in Egypt during the first Suez crisis, and then was invited back by President Nasser as the only British envoy that he trusted to try and repair relations after the Six-Day War.
Wow.
And so basically I kind of grew up in a household, plus I grew up as a kid in Cairo when my father was sent back in 1967. That's showing my age. And then basically I just grew up in a household that was constantly sort of focused on Middle East affairs. I didn't pay much attention for much of my life, actually, until my father died in 2001. And then basically I started to go through all of his papers, and long story short, I ended up going to Egypt and Gaza in 2012. I spent some time in Gaza in 2012, 2013, and more as an activist than as a journalist. But of course, like many activists, once you start seeing on the ground what is happening, you start writing about it, and then that effectively becomes your process of being able to present the reality from on the ground. And then I basically started seeing what was happening in Syria, and from 2014 onwards was covering events there. 2015, I tried a number of times to enter Syria, and I finally managed in 2016 in June with a US peace delegation. And really it went from there. From then on in, I was going back every 2 or 3 months covering the front lines of all of the liberations by the Syrian Arab Army against, of course, the regime change project that had been established by the West and Israel and Turkey and the Arab Gulf states and so on. So I guess that's really a very, very condensed version of what happened.
That's so interesting. So have you spent like most of your life in the Middle East, or have you spent most of your time in Britain, or what do you think of home when you think of home?
Oh, here in the Middle East, Syria in particular.
Yeah. And it's a shame what's happening in Syria. So tell me a bit about, like, because as I understand it, I think you also got to interview Bashar al-Assad as well. You have extensive knowledge of the region, especially of the country Syria. Before we get into, obviously, what's happening between Iran and Israel, I'd love to get your thoughts about what happened in Syria, but what's currently going on in Syria, because Syria is such an important country in the Middle East, and it's for me, it's very sad and upsetting to see what's going on there.
Yeah. So basically, I was living in Syria from 2019 until 2024. So December last year, I left when Damascus fell, literally the morning, or that it fell during the night of the 7th, but it fell completely by the morning of the 8th. And that was the day that I finally left Damascus after 5 years living there. And, you know, Syria was for me my home. I didn't intend to leave. I intended to stay there into my old age. And of course, that wasn't to be. And myself and many other people tried to leave at that stage. Some didn't succeed. And now, of course, we have what the West was trying to achieve for the last 14 years. We have an Al-Qaeda unelected regime in power that is conducting ethnic cleansing programs across Syria against all of the ethnic minorities, from Christians to Alawites to Druze to even Sunni that are non-compliant with the Takfiri Wahhabi doctrine, of course, incubated in the British protectorate Gulf states. So in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in UAE, and so on. And basically all of these factions are being slowly wiped out in Syria, leaving only, of course, the kind of the GCC Takfiri project in place, backed by Turkey and the West and by Israel, of course.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm hearing myself when I'm talking, which is a little bit distracting.
It must be distracting to you, but I couldn't hear an echo, so.
No, okay.
So, about like the followers of Giuliani, how much force does he actually have to rule over the whole country, and how sustainable do you think is the current state of affairs? Especially if he's not going to, and I don't know if he is or not, you tell me, but if he's not going to incorporate the minorities, all of the different groups within Syria into the government, and if he's going to be dictatorial, I can't see how he would have enough soldiers behind him to rule over the whole country. How sustainable do you think is the current situation?
I recently wrote about this, actually. I mean, Giuliani struggled to hold on to power in Idlib in northwest Syria. And that was even with the help of the US. The US were effectively assassinating his competitors in Idlib to keep him in power. And from about 2021 onwards, it became very clear that Giuliani was being groomed as the so-called political opposition to President Assad and the Syrian government, with the PBS interviews. And then I think there was one with CNN. And that more recently, we found out that MI6 linked NGOs were working with him to improve his image, put him in a suit, brush his beard, and cut his hair and make him look less like an Al-Qaeda fanatic. And of course, originally he was ISIS before he changed into Nusra Front in Syria, which is effectively the Al-Qaeda in Syria. And he struggled in Idlib, even though he led a very dictatorial regime in the region, based on extremist Sharia law, the execution of civilians if, in the opinion of his cohorts, they had committed a crime under Sharia law, and the imprisonment of dissidents and people who were challenging his rule, or as I said, the assassination. Now he has control of all of Syria in theory. But of course he doesn't, because the reason that many of the Takfiri elements came under his control was that he made promises both of a Takfiri caliphate in Syria to many of the foreign mercenaries that were enabling his rise to power. His forces probably comprise around 30% to 40% of foreign Takfiri mercenaries. So that gives you an idea of the extent to which he's dependent upon those forces. And that includes the Uyghurs, the Chechens, Afghani forces, the TIP, the Turkestan Party, and so on. And of course, they are the more extremist factions under his control. And now they're complaining because now he's being seen to be pivoting towards the West and so-called democracy and normalization with Israel and adopting Western norms in order, of course, to achieve the lifting of sanctions and the funding that he desperately needs in order to rebuild the country after he and his militia destroyed it for the last 14 years. And so therefore, but this isn't the only issue he has. Of course, he has multiple regional players pushing him from pillar to post because he has to keep them all happy. That includes Russia and Turkey and the Arab Gulf states and Israel and the US and the UK and France. And so, there's a huge amount of pressure on him, quite rightly, because he's their puppet at the end of the day. And then, of course, you have the ethnic minorities within Syria itself that he is persecuting, who, although at the moment they haven't taken up arms against him, we know that there are factions that are prepared to do so, but are only looking for some kind of political support from outside Syria to give them the impetus to do so. And not only that, but more recently, I've been hearing from certain factions like the former Free Syrian Army that are now pretty much incorporated into the Turkish factions, but are definitely Syrian nationals that are saying, you know, we've had enough of Jolani because Jolani is using them as scapegoats. And so they're saying, no, okay, like we don't want to get the blame for these massacres. So I tell you what, we'll provide evidence that it's Jolani that's doing it if you'll take the pressure off us. And this is normal. You know, the US has created a cauldron of competing agendas and alliances and ideologies that Jolani is never going to be able to control. And I mean, when you talk about the normalization with Israel that Jolani is really being pushed into a corner to accept, the majority of Syrians grew up in an environment where Israel was the recognized enemy in the region. And so this, again, is going to be another aspect that's going to be very difficult for him to reconcile with the Syrian people.
So interesting. Talking about Israel as well, actually, how do you see, because I see at the moment Israel's trying to make maybe like a wall of little minorities pro-Israel across the region, including like the Kurds of Iraq. How are, for example, the Kurds or other groups, are they sympathetic groups that are aligning with Israel inside Syria at the moment, just to gain that short-term benefit and maybe trying to make a bigger position for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. You do have factions within Syria, like the Syrian Kurds, for example, that were perceived by Israel as, in a sense, a settlement project, which would enable them to extend their occupation of Syrian lands from the south up the eastern corridor, so the borders with Iraq and Jordan, and create what they call the David's Corridor. Now, they were reliant upon the Kurds being given control of that northeastern region to give them access to that region, because the Kurds perceived as at least friendly towards Israel. Of course, they've been backed by the US for a number of years to control Syrian resources, including oil and agriculture in the northeast, and prevent the Syrian state from being able to access them, and therefore deprive the Syrian people of access to those resources. And then you do have the Druze factions in the southeast predominantly, although they're dotted all over the south. And there are factions within the Druze. People tend to describe the Druze as some kind of homogenous movement or homogenous community. They're not. There are sort of a number of factions within the Druze community, some that are to a degree allied with Israel, particularly the Druze, for example, in the occupied Golan territories. You do have, of course, the Golani brigades in Israel, which are made up of, to some degree, the Druze from the Golan, the occupied Golan. And there are Druze factions that are quite happy to collaborate with Israel in order to, as they see it, to protect their communities in the south, because there have been attacks on the Druze communities from Jolani's thugs in the last few months.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. It's so hugely complicated. It reminds me a lot because originally my family comes from Pakistan, which borders Afghanistan. When I was doing my master's, my thesis was based on the Taliban in Afghanistan. And what's going on in Syria reminds me so much of what was happening in Afghanistan. So many different tribes, different ethnicities, different languages. And then those influences from all the countries like Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, America. But I feel that like maybe the difference was that, first of all, the Taliban had their bases in the biggest ethnic group, which was the Pashtuns. But what they were doing is they weren't fighting for the Pashtuns. And because in Afghanistan, basically most of the population was Muslims, so there wasn't Christians and other groups. And what the Taliban were doing is they were fighting, instead of fighting for Pashtuns, they were trying to bring in Islam, which kind of then put the tribal differences aside, and it put a whole different kind of a take on the whole situation. So people found it somewhat easier to agree with him, although obviously there were still tribal differences. Whereas in Syria, there's the extreme Islam that they represent, the Jilani guys. It wouldn't even suit like the Sufis and all of the other who are Sunnis, but they are not of that extremist kind of, as you said, Takfiri groups. So it's going to be quite difficult. But also another thing, what happened in Afghanistan is that ultimately when the Taliban were defeated during their first term, everyone turned on, first of all of those foreign fighters that were in there. So I can kind of see that happening at some stage, because there's so many foreign fighters from Central Asia, from China, all of these places. And I don't know what's going to happen to them, but we can kind of get an idea from what happened in Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think what a lot of this regime change is about is ultimately squeezing Iran and Iranian influence out of the region. Because if you look at who they're putting in their place in Syria, for example, and Syria, of course, was the hub of the resistance axis, not only as a land bridge, but Syria was manufacturing. A lot of people don't actually know this. Syria was the main manufacturer of the weapons that were then sent to the Lebanese resistance and to the Palestinian resistance. So it was incredibly important for a number of factors, and the fact that there were resistance factions that were operating from inside Syrian territory and leading the attacks, for example, against the occupied Golan during the genocide, or I don't like sort of assuming that the genocide only began on the 7th of October, but the intensification of the genocide that began after the 7th of October, there were resistance attacks being made from inside Syrian territory. And that was, to a degree, the point of Syria, not to enter itself into defending Palestine, but to open its territory to all of the resistance factions from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Palestine, and even from Jordan and further afield, to bolster the front against Palestine. And that's why, of course, for Israel and for the US and the UK, it was so important to bring Syria down, to bring it to its knees, and to utterly destroy its capability militarily, from a naval perspective, from an air perspective, and of course, most importantly, from an air defense perspective. And that's what Israel did within hours of Damascus falling. I mean, I remember the last night hearing the bunker buster bombs falling because Previously, Israel hadn't been able to use them because of the air defense in Syria that was very effective, actually, in preventing Israel destroying so much of the Syrian infrastructure during the time of the former Syrian government. And so, I think what we're seeing is this war against Iran, which has been waged, first of all, against the factions that are in alliance with Iran. People in the West love to call them proxies, but the reality is they're not. They're independent allies who Iran has assisted to a large degree or come to the assistance of, like Syria.
Vanessa, you did mention the fact that Israel is trying to eliminate Iranian influence in the region. And that actually brought me to the question I wanted to ask, which is there's a lot of talk about the resistance in the region weakened, what happened in obviously Syria, but what's happened in Lebanon and other places. Talking about Lebanon, what is the situation with Hezbollah at the moment? Of course, they didn't take part in this war that just took place between Iran and Israel. But generally speaking, what is the situation?
I mean, there's a lot of media hype that Hezbollah has been weakened to a very dangerous level, and I would say that's not true. Of course, they took a huge number of blows, particularly with the assassination of their leadership, including Syed Hassan Nasrallah, of course. But to say that they've been downgraded or degraded in any way is actually inaccurate. Hezbollah accepted the ceasefire to basically avoid, to a degree, civil war within Lebanon itself. And also, I remember at the time that the ceasefire actually happened, I said, okay, now they're going to pivot to Syria. And I remember saying it because it was clear that that's what was going to happen. And to a degree, it's going to happen again with the so-called ceasefire with Iran. They're going to pivot again back to Lebanon now. And we've seen a build-up of the resistance forces on the border with Syria to repel any potential for ISIS or HTS attacks, which have been ongoing, of course, in the northeast of Lebanon for some time on a sort of low-grade level. And Israel has been increasing its attacks in the south of Lebanon over the last 2 weeks. In fact, since the aggression against Iran kicked off, Israel has been targeting to a much larger degree the areas in the south and increasing its occupation of the 5 points that it's refused to vacate in the south of Lebanon. And ultimately, what they're pushing for, of course, is the total, I won't say annihilation of Hezbollah, but the total removal of Hezbollah from the picture. So they're putting pressure on the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah. They're withholding, and so is the US, they're withholding funds for reconstruction until Hezbollah disarms and so on. So the pressure is on Lebanon to basically comply. And you'll probably have seen the poster that was put up in Tel Aviv showing the countries that are going to normalize with Israel. And there was a photo of President Aoun of Lebanon on the billboard, alongside, of course, Jolani in Syria, who I refuse to call president. He's not president. He wasn't elected by the people. And he's Al-Qaeda ultimately. So, he doesn't belong in Syria.
Well, yeah.
So, really, I guess Lebanon now is preparing for a pivot back to them. And while Iran is preparing for the next stage, of course, potentially what they will try and do is to weaken the resistance in Lebanon and in Iraq in particular.
Yeah. So going to Iran, this conflict that took place, the 12-day conflict, and how Trump is saying that the Iranian nuclear program was devastated, and obviously all the intelligence that's coming out is saying to the contrary. How do you see that? Like, how much do you think we should insist trying to get correct Trump, or how much do you think by correcting him are we actually pushing him towards a second attack on Iran? Because ultimately, if he's saying that the problem is solved, then there is no reason for further conflict with Iran.
Yeah, look, I don't think it makes any difference what you say to Trump or what you analyze about what Trump is saying, because Trump, one of his most important roles is to create confusion and chaos, because the US thrives on confusion and chaos. It's like in Syria, what they would prefer to do is to have organized chaos, so that Syria can never restabilize and rebuild itself as a sovereign nation. They don't want that. They want to be able to pick off the resources, to enable Israel to expand, to give Turkey a piece of the pie, perhaps to negotiate Russia keeping its base there so it can maintain its influence in Africa and so on. So Syria basically becomes a cake that they all want a piece of, and the US is quite happy for that to happen, just as it has been in all of the other countries that it's decimated and destroyed over the years, of course. And so when you look at what Israel and the US wanted to achieve, and if you really want to understand what this is, you can look at any of the kind of US think tank strategy papers, but especially go back to the Brookings Institute strategy paper from 2009, Which Path to Persia, a New American Strategy for Iran. And there you have it all laid out. So what they want to achieve is regime change from within, to prevent Iranian nuclear development. It doesn't actually matter if it's a nuclear weapon. They just don't want Iran to develop anything as regards nuclear energy. But they also want to prevent the missile program, which has been proven to be very effective. And so those are the three main points, right, that they wanted to achieve. Well, what actually came out of this war? Iran very effectively protected its nuclear program, from what we understand, from this side of the fence. The Iranian people, even those who were in opposition to the revolutionaries, for example, are now unified behind their country, behind the army, the IRGC, and the supreme leadership. And even the government, which can be described as reformist and Western pivoting, has had to kind of keep quiet, because the people now are behind the sovereignty of Iran, behind the integrity of Iran as a country. And the fact that we've seen millions of people come onto the streets across the country for the funerals of the military command that were assassinated in the first few hours of the Israeli aggression is a very strong message to the West and to Israel, which is that regime change right now isn't going to be a thing. It's not going to work. And if anything, what you've now done is to fortify inside Iran, because the people now have become a weapon for the military to find the spies, to detect them, to report them, So in a sense, they've weaponized all of Iran against them now. And from a missile development program, I mean, it's ridiculous. What country is going to say to its enemy, which is obviously hostile to it, oh yeah, okay, we'll stop producing any defense capability whatsoever, especially when they've seen what has happened to Syria, right?
Yes. And then they've seen how successful their missiles are as well.
Yeah, exactly. And they haven't even used, apparently, their more advanced or their more sophisticated missiles. And I think what Iran also did through economy of scale, and this is very important because a lot of people compared the kind of blitzkrieg attacks by Israel and even the US generally to what Iran did. And some people are kind of, yeah, but they didn't fire enough missiles. But hang on, look at the damage that they did in an incredibly small entity land, territory, right? Sorry, that was a bit, you know what I mean? Like the land that Israel occupies, which is Palestine, but the land that Israel occupies is tiny in comparison to the landmass of Iran. So it's obvious to me that Israel is going to have to use more missiles to target the huge landmass of Iran.
Exactly.
Yeah. And by using one missile, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I also think it's amazing that, with that said, how much civilian casualties Iran was able to prevent in Israel. I mean, if they wanted, they could have caused so much destruction in civilian lives, but they didn't. And it's completely the opposite to what Israel's used to.
Yeah, and actually, I think there's a number of, I think it was the head of the unit 8200 who said it's nonsense. You know, Iran is targeting, I think when all the hype was about Iran targeting the hospital in Tel Aviv, and he came on Israeli TV and said they're not, they're targeting military installations. This is nonsense. You know, so even within Israel, they're contradicting the hype in the West and from Israeli media. And when you look at, as I said, the economy of scale, but the damage that Iran has managed to do to Israeli infrastructure, in particular to the intelligence and development agencies like the Weizmann Institute, Haifa port has got huge damage. They did huge damage to the gas supply, the fuel supply, and so on, which I think is going to be, out of service for quite a while. And the billions in repair now. And this is all starting to come out because, of course, Israel was censoring any information coming out from the damage caused by Iranian missiles. And there was even a German journalist who was saying this is ridiculous. We're only allowed to report on areas that are civilian areas. So it's going to sound like only civilian areas are being hit by Iran, when in reality, it's a huge percentage is military infrastructure that's getting targeted. And we still don't know the command in Israel, who was targeted, who was hit. And probably we're never going to know because Israel keeps a very tight lid on this information, unlike the resistance, who honor their martyrs by naming them and publicly burying them. There's never any subterfuge from Iran, from Hezbollah, when it comes to admitting the assassination of their top leadership, their military command, and their nuclear scientists, who are not men of war, they're men of science.
Yeah.
And yet they were clearly being targeted by Israel.
But also, given all of this, and given this is now where we are, so Israel not only was not able to achieve any of its objectives, but to the contrary, has in many ways made Iran stronger. But that doesn't mean Israel is now just going to change its policy, change its mind. Israel is going to double down in trying to do what they were trying to do to begin with. So USA is still going to back Israel to the hilt. Iran is still insisting, or is definitely going to insist, that they are not going to stop the civilian nuclear program, which they have every right to. Where do you see things going from here? Because there were some talks about like Trump coming up with some backdoor diplomacy and some kind of incentive to Iran, billions of dollars of investment and all of this. But in return, Iran would have to give up its nuclear program, which I don't see it doing. So where do you see things going from here, other than just a repeat?
Yeah, I mean, there have been very strong statements from officials within the IRGC and within even, I think, Imam Khamenei put out a very strong message. You know, they're not in a position where they have to negotiate. They didn't surrender. The surrender or the ceasefire was requested by Israel, not by Iran. In fact, if you remember, there was a lot of confusion from Iran because Trump was yelling on social media that there was a ceasefire, and Iran was scratching its head to some degree and going, well, we didn't ask for it. I think. And so, Iran has been, even before the Israeli aggression, or the most recent one, Iran was very clear that its red line was its ability to enrich uranium for nuclear energy development. And it's not going to back down on that. And the fact that it's been proven that they can hold their own against two nuclear powers, one Israel, one the US, and of course all of the peripheral states that were involved in supporting the aggression. But Iran held its own, so it's in a strong position. It's not in a weak position. So why on earth would it accept? Even if Trump were to offer, I don't know how many billions for what? Why do they need it? They've developed their missile program under 40 years of sanctions.
Yeah.
Iran is an incredibly proud nation, as I'm sure you know. It's not going to accept these kind of insane deals. And also they know very well that Trump will say something on social media on Monday, and by Monday afternoon, he's changed it to something else. So, this is the point again of Trump, is that he sows this confusion and total sort of instability in his negotiating style. And Iran isn't having anything to do with it. And so ultimately, I think now, as I said, I think Israel will turn back to kind of, in its view, decapitating the resistance factions that would be the greatest danger to the US and Israel should the war restart. And in my opinion, that, of course, is Lebanon and Iraq, because in Iraq, you have the resistance factions there that can target any of the US bases at any given moment. And they threatened to do so while the war was ongoing between Israel and Iran. And to a degree, Israel and the US will have used this information to understand the groups that are the biggest threat. And so therefore, I think they're going to try and decapitate those groups and weaken them before the potential of a restart of the war against Iran.
Well, I think
I have talked about this, and I do think there is also a potential for a false flag at some point, potentially on American soil, to mobilize the people of America against Iran. Because right now, even people who were buying into the propaganda of women's rights and all of this nonsense in Iran are now kind of sitting back and going, gosh, Iran did a really good job. And they did it very respectfully. They were not crazy, and even after the first 6 hours when we were watching the awful assassinations of some of the most kind of legendary figures in Iranian military forces, which was horrible. All of us were struggling with those first few hours, but they recovered. And this is a huge point to make. They didn't fall to their knees. They recovered and they hit back and they maintained it. And it became very clear that they could maintain this war for a lot longer than Israel can, because Israel is, for a large part, a consumer. Iran is a manufacturer.
Yeah.
So there's a huge difference.
Very good. So Iran was able to fight an 8-year war with Iraq and still survive. So
yeah, with far less capability, actually, as far as I know.
Also, there's a lot of talk about this 60% uranium that was enriched by Iran. I think it's 400 kg of uranium. Initially, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it was part of the negotiations that were ongoing that Iran was increased to that level of enrichment to use that as leverage, because they were trying to remove the sanctions that were. It was promised that the sanctions will get lifted if they keep their end of the bargain, which they did. But the sanctions weren't being lifted. So they, as a leverage, they started increasing the enrichment levels. But now there's this huge amount of enriched uranium sitting somewhere. I think in the initial negotiations, there was talks that if everything gets agreed upon, then that can be exported to Russia or wherever. But now, not only does no one know where that's gone, but I've heard that Iran now no longer wants to negotiate that out of the country, and they want to, because if any deal happens with America in the future, it's not worth the paper it's written on. At any point, they could eliminate the uranium, eliminate all the threats, and then tear up the piece of paper anyway. So Iran wants to have that as a insurance policy, and are happy that um, foreign inspectors could observe it if it comes to that, but they're not going to let it go. What are your thoughts on all of this? Am I missing anything there?
No, not at all. I think you're absolutely right. I think Iran, they know that the US and Israel are not honest brokers. History has shown us that the US never honors a single deal. Israel never honors a single deal, particularly a ceasefire. I mean, it had a ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it hasn't stopped bombing or attempting to invade Lebanese territory since the ceasefire. So it pays no attention to any agreement that it comes to with a sovereign nation that it considers, or it doesn't even have to consider them an enemy. Even with Egypt, it's reneged on various deals, like with the Philadelphia Corridor and so on. And Egypt, to a large degree, is an ally of Israel now. Since '79, it's very much a collaborator with Israel in the punishment of the Palestinians and so on, and the genocide. And the fact that Iran has now basically said to the IAEA, no, that's it. We're withdrawing from discussions, because ultimately it's clear that the IAEA was responsible for leaking the information about the nuclear scientists that led to their assassination. So the IAEA has Iranian blood on its hands, and that's not going to be forgotten. And the potential for Iran, even withdrawing from the NPT, is high. And if that happens, Iran can develop whatever it wants to develop. It's no longer under the constraints. And why should it be under the constraints of an organization and a bloc in the West that is intent on its destruction and the murder of members of its society? Why would you be? No one should expect that of anyone. If someone comes into your house and murders your wife and children, you're not going to shake hands with them and agree to hand your house over to them. I mean, that's effectively what the Western Israel is expecting Iran to do. And it's not going to do that. And at the same time, of course, Iran has, I'm just writing something at the moment about the allies that Iran has in the region. And when you talk about American bases surrounding Iran, at the same time, there is a ring of fire of the allies of Iran that surround American bases, surround the Arab Gulf states and their oil facilities, surround Israel. And so therefore, Iran, to a degree, this is almost like a sort of who blinks first scenario, And in my opinion, Iran is never going to blink. And if you think that might be the case, then you're underestimating a 1,000-year-old culture and civilization, and a huge country.
Yes.
It's vast.
To be honest, I had no idea how big Iran was until this all started, even though it's right next door to Pakistan. But I had no idea how massive it is.
Yeah.
Talking about Iran's allies.
There in 2022. Sorry.
Oh, did you? Did you go all over the country?
I traveled a bit. I went to 3 or 4 cities. I was there for about just under 2 weeks. But I would love to go back and explore the whole of the country, because it's so diverse. I'm sure very similar to Pakistan, but it's an amazing country.
It is. Talking of Iran's allies, how do you see the role played by China, but especially Russia? Because there's been a lot of, in social media and stuff, there's been a lot of concerns raised by fans of Iran, but also enemies of Iran were gloating that Russia didn't play much of a role. I don't know how true that is, but I'd like to get your opinion on how do you see the role of Russia particularly, and also China in this conflict?
I think it's very complex, of course. But having seen the degree to which Russia did abandon Syria for very pragmatic reasons, Assad was not basically giving in to Russian pressure on a number of issues, including the exclusion of Iran and the exclusion of the resistance factions, and a pivot towards the Arab Gulf states and so on. And he didn't go to the negotiating table with Erdogan, which was a big deal for Russia. And he didn't sign off on the new constitution. So I think Russia lost patience, but at the same time, I think it did. I was on the ground. I saw what happened, and Russia did effectively abandon Syria to the Al Qaeda factions to a huge degree, for whatever the reason.
Yeah.
And I think Iran is perfectly well aware of this, because there was a point at which Iran was prepared to send reinforcements and they were given the green light. And then when they set off, Putin basically said no. And the US threatened to bring down the plane over Iraqi territory. And so they had to return back to Tehran. So Iran is very well aware. The resistance factions here are very well aware of Russia's role. And, they appreciate what Russia did do in 2015 onwards, but they don't see Russia as an ideological ally, as they may have seen the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Although the Soviet Union also signed off on the Zionist project in Palestine, of course. And so while Iran has this strategic partnership with Russia, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, a mutual defense pact built into that agreement. There is between Russia and North Korea. If another country attacks North Korea, Russia will come to their defense. But, and this is an important point, it's unlikely to be Israel that will attack North Korea, because North Korea is a nuclear state. So that is not going to bring Russia in conflict with Israel. And that's the important point here. According to everyone here in Lebanon and many of the Syrian analysts that I speak to, for Russia, the red line is any threat to the existence of Israel in the region. There's more than 1 million Russians living in Israel.
Yep.
Many of them are in opposition to President Putin, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
And so I think the important factor here is Israel. Russia isn't going to publicly put itself in a position of potential conflict with Israel and the US. And therefore with Iran, it cannot publicly come out in full support of Iran. And I found it very interesting that Sergei Lavrov was pushing Iran after the ceasefire to come back to the NPT, come back to the negotiating table with the IAEA, but he wasn't pushing Israel to join the NPT or disclose its nuclear weapon development program, right? There was no mention of that. So again, we have this very one-sided, well, Iran has to comply with everything, but Israel can do what it wants. And Israel has the Samson doctrine, which means it can use nuclear weapons if it faces an existential threat.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And I think you're right. I think Iran knows to what extent it can rely on Russia. But I think also Iran is a proud nation. Iran doesn't want to have complete dependence on either Russia or China. I mean, the whole point of the revolution was to have independence from both West and East. So they don't want to be subservient to anyone, which is an important part of their policy. So I think going forward, we'll probably see some changes in the relationship between Russia and Iran if some of this has taken place, because Iran's provided a lot of assistance to Russia against the war in Ukraine. And for Russia to turn around and say we don't have a military pact was a bit ridiculous, I think. But I think on the other hand, China is proving a lot more reliable. And I think even coming out of this, I think Iran might rethink some of its military purchases. Those planes that Su-35s or whatever it was that Iran was trying to purchase from Russia. I think now Iran might turn towards China and see China as a more reliable partner.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Well, I think China demonstrated its military prowess through Pakistan, of course,
Yes.
in the recent skirmish between India and Pakistan. And I think what was interesting for me was very early on, Pakistan came out with a very strong statement in support of Iran. And then within 3 or 4 days, the kind of resistance factions supported by Iran inside Pakistan also came out with a very strong statement. So I think even though China might not supply directly, and I don't know what you think about this, but perhaps you're more informed from the Pakistan perspective.
Yeah.
But perhaps through Pakistan, China might sort of help Iran from that perspective. Because I think also what's important is if Iran falls, even though Russia may not publicly want to support Iran, Russia and China know that if Iran falls, then there's no buffer between them and a war against them. And so it's in their interest to keep Iran strong, even though Russia has this added complication of its, tacit or more overt these days support for Israel. China has less of an issue with that. It has huge investment in Israel.
Yes.
I think it's one of the its export to Israel is at the top of the trade mountain of people supplying Israel. It has invested in Haifa port, as it has, of course, globally in many of the, particularly the European ports and so on. That's what China is doing. It's building influence through soft power. And so for China, the defense of Israel is not so important. But the defense of Iran, I think for China is more important because it understands that Iran is a sort of bulwark for them in the region.
Absolutely. I think I completely agree. I think even for Russia, Iran is a very important country because of its north-south trade corridor that it's trying to establish. And Russia, for the longest time, has been trying to gain access to warm waters, which was what they were trying to do in Syria, which was actually part of the reason that they invaded Afghanistan to begin with, because it's one of their weaknesses that they don't have access to warm waters. And that's what Iran and Pakistan could provide. So I think that's very important for Russia. And also, Iran historically has been a launching pad for if you end up with an anti-Russian government inside Iran, that's going to cause all sorts of problems for Russia in the future. But also, I think what's going on, what you mentioned in South Asia, is very important because the recent conflict that took place between India and Pakistan was very interesting because India was supported by Israel, one of the only countries that came out and openly supported India. And of course, Pakistan was being supported by China. And it was the first time, Pakistan and China have had a long friendship going back decades now. And in that time, India and Pakistan have had a number of wars, but China's never come out that openly and aggressively in statements saying that we're going to protect Pakistan's sovereignty and Pakistan's borders and all of that. But still, obviously, they're not going to. A lot of the help that they provided Pakistan was not openly during the war, but it was more things like intelligence, satellite, surveillance, which was very, very important, which helped Pakistan see further into India, guide their missiles and all of those things. So those are the kinds of things that China can help Iran with if things go that way in the future. But also, I think a few ways China's really helping as well is this whole ban on rare earth material going to the West for military and arms purposes. And I think that's one of the reasons, the main things that's slowing down missile production in the West, which of course is having a huge impact on Israel in not having enough interceptors to intercept incoming missiles from Iran. But at the same time, China's not putting any of those sanctions on Iran, so Iran can go ahead and carry on making missiles. So I think there's lots that China can do from behind the scenes without openly. It's not China's way to come out openly and get involved in wars and confront militarily countries like USA. But China can provide a lot of assistance. But I think another thing that happened that I found really interesting is that India's had long-term relations with Iran in the past. Pakistan's had a lot of differences with Iran. Obviously, they're Muslim countries, so they have brotherly nations, but at the same time, they've had a number of disputes, including the missile attacks back and forth that took place a couple of years ago. The war that happened between India and Pakistan, Iran didn't come and support Pakistan, but they kind of didn't openly support India as well, and they tried to stay neutral. And they said that both countries should negotiate and come to the table and stop fighting. Whereas when this happened, I was quite relieved to see that Pakistan went all out in support of Iran, whereas India didn't do that because of its relationships with Israel. I think there's a lot of shifting alliances happening in the region because India has its economic interest tied with Iran because it wants to use Iran to gain access to Central Asia, but it has a strategic interest tied with Israel and with the USA and with the West. So I think it's very interesting what's happening. And now that there is this pause in the war, I think it'll be interesting to see how new alliances forge and some of the old ones might change.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I think, it's a very fluid picture at the moment, and I think it's very hard to conclude anything. I think they just have to be prepared for any twists and turns, because one thing that Trump is very good at, and it became clear to me when he was up for election that he was going to win. Because I said this is the point in the US roadmap where they need Trump back in, because he creates this atmosphere of both potential and confusion. And this is exactly what he did back in 2016, while, of course, he assassinated commanders Soleimani and Mohandas, which was the head of the Iraqi resistance, the PMF forces. He brought in the Abraham Accords. He basically gifted the occupied Golan back to Israel, not back to, and he was going to move the US embassy into occupied Al-Quds. So, it's very clear that he was brought in at this particular juncture in the roadmap to lead the war against Iran and to effectively bring about the new Middle East, which, the US has been talking about in its pools of power for years now, more than 20 years. And of course, the new Middle East means the takeover of the region by the GCC, by effectively the kind of Wahhabi Takfiri elements, and the erosion of all other Muslim communities, led, of course, in their view, by Iran. But as I keep saying, they're not led by Iran. They're an alliance of Iran.
Yeah.
Because if you look at Yemen, the Zaydis are very different in their Shia Muslim belief to the 12ers in Iran. So there are differences between the various factions in the different countries. And for me, what is important is that the resistance factions are all inclusive of all other communities, whether it's Christian, whether it's Sunni Muslim. Hezbollah has a Christian militia within its resistance forces. The PMF has Christian and Sunni Muslim. So they're inclusive. But the GCC, Zionist, normalized Arab states are not inclusive. They're sectarian. And we're seeing that in Syria with the ethnic cleansing programs that Jolani is leading.
So true. When I see all of this and I see Israel's options being reduced, especially after what happened in this war, um, my fear is that Israel, whenever it's faced with these kind of things, it always goes back to very dirty tactics like the mobile phone attacks, the pagers attack, or even this attack on the first day through kind of those drones hidden away. Basically, just terrorist tactics. And I'm sure Israel's going to have a few more of those up its sleeve some ways. Just have no idea what it's going to be. But I hope that Iran's able to detect that before anything happens. But that's one of my worries. We'll see what happens.
I think it's a worry for everyone, particularly when they've openly declared that they want to assassinate Imam Khamenei.
Yes.
I mean, this is obvious. And even al-Houthi, Said al-Houthi, the leader of Ansarullah in Yemen, who I think has been targeted up until now. But they failed. Or in Yemen, they have a problem because they don't have the same level of intelligence that they seem to have elsewhere in the resistance countries. But yeah, for sure, they will continue this kind of tactic. And you're right. I think, when they are pushed into a corner, even when to a degree in pre-1948, of course, when the British were not coming into line or were not giving them as much benefit or advantage as they wanted in the occupied territories, what did they do? Sure, they carried out terrorist attacks against the British themselves, and that's what they do. And so, yeah, I just hope Iran is prepared. I think this is one of the big lessons that Iran took from this war, which is that they have to be, they really have to police both the borders and their internal territory.
Yes.
And I really do hope they've tightened up on that, because a lot of the attacks came from Azerbaijan,
yes.
From neighboring countries, which of course was obvious to me because they'd been building up factions there to use against Iran for some time. So yeah, I just hope Iran is prepared for those, and that we are here, even in Lebanon, because people are talking about the resurgence of Takfiri suicide bombings and so on, which there is high potential for that. There was a cell caught a few days ago in the north of Lebanon before they'd been able to conduct any attacks. So we know it's ongoing here also.
Yeah. Vanessa, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned a lot from you, and I'd love to have you back one day. There's so much to talk about. I'd love to get your thoughts more on Yemen, because I know you're an expert on Yemen as well. So yeah, inshallah, we'll have you back one day whenever you can make it. But thank you so much for joining us. And do please share any links with me for your social media or your blog or anything. I'd love to put it on the notes so people can follow you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.